Good morning, good morning, good morning. How's everyone this morning? You would think that by virtue of me being an extrovert, I would not be nervous every time I get up in front of people. So we're in the house of worship, so y'all pray for me, okay? Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to be here. I was here last year, and I was sitting in the audience last year, and I was so moved and stretched and sometimes angered by what I heard last year. I felt like this year I needed to be a part of it. And so when he says that it begins with a thought, and every action begins with a thought, I was thinking a lot of things in my seat last year. So I'm here, and I encourage you to do the same thing. I just want to introduce today Dr. Melissa Clarke. I'm excited about what she has to say. She's talking about epigenetics, and that's something that's near and dear to my heart because I look at all of the trauma in Baltimore City. Our location is in the heart of Baltimore City. And I think about all of the anger and the depression and the anxiety that our people suffer and face every single day. And you think about all of the rage that must be contained in the bodies. Where does that start? And how do we take care of it? And how do we take care of our people? So Dr. Melissa Clarke is a board-certified emergency physician and founder and CEO of the BHE Group, a longtime champion of health equity, health literacy, and patient advocacy. She's the author of the best-selling book of healthcare consumers. Excuse me, doctor, I've got what? So join me as we are blessed by Dr. Melissa Clarke today.
I am blessed and honored to be here today. Thank you to the BMHA board and Jan Desper-Peters for the invitation. And I am going to be, as you heard, delving into the topic of epigenetics and talking about some of the themes that Dr. Washington talked about with toxic stress and how that actually affects our genome. And really, those same effects and what we can learn from that also teaches us about resiliency. So we're going to talk about that too, and then we're going to talk about how we can use this as clinicians in our practices. And I'm going to use the example of my practice in DC, Medical Home Development Group, and how we're using it. But first, I want to start off with a quote. Now, I'm sure all of you, if you watch TMZ or you watch CNN, you heard about our friend Kanye West talking about slavery being a choice. And Baltimore's own Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote a scathing rebuttal. Did anybody see that? Anybody read that? Scathing rebuttal. And in it, he used this quote. And at the time, I was actually preparing my outline for this, and I read this quote, and I was like, oh my God, that really goes to what I'm talking about. So I have it up here. He will serve us better if we bring him from Africa, naked and thingless. So the Bukra reasoned, Bukra meaning white person. They tore away his clothes so that Cuffy might bring nothing away, but Cuffy seized his drum and hid it under his skin, under the skull bones. So he laughed with cunning and said, I, who am born away to become an orphan, carry my parents with me. For rhythm, is she not my mother, and drama is her man? So he groaned aloud in the ships and hid his drum and laughed. And you're like, what does that have to do with epigenetics? Well, this is actually originally a quote from Zora Neale Hurston, from the book Jonas Gordvine in 1934. And when I read it, Ta-Nehisi Coates was actually using it to talk about the fact that rhythm and music is our innate gift, and that Kanye West, whether he deserved it or not, inherited that innate gift. But when I read about the drum being hidden under the skin and under the skull bones, I thought that about our genome, about our DNA, how it's something that it's inextricably linked to us and can never be taken away. And then I thought about him being in the ship and how he hid his drum so nobody could get it. Nobody can take your DNA. It's who you are. It's what makes you up. It's what makes you a survivor through all that we as African Americans have been through. And he laughed, which talks to me about the resilience. So as we go through this talk today, kind of keep this in mind. So just to level set, the word stress gets thrown around, in a variety of contexts. I'm too blessed to be stressed, or you stressing me out. So I just wanted to go back to the original scientist that came up with the word. And his definition is the nonspecific response of the body to any demand for change. And then the dictionary definition is a condition or feeling experienced when a person perceives that the demands of the situation exceed their personal and social resources that they're able to mobilize. So both of those definitions have in common that stress is a response, right? So in the first one, it's the nonspecific response of the body to any outside force demanding that you change, that you leave your comfort zone. And the other is, it's a condition or feeling that's experienced. It's a response to an outside situation. And so, to distinguish the concept of the outside situation being the stress, the word stressor is used. So the stressor is the thing that happens to you. The stress is how you interpret it, both mentally and physically. So stress is really an individual experience. And I like this analogy of the roller coaster ride. So the stressor is the roller coaster ride, right? It's no different. Any amusement park, high heights, fast speeds, scary. I don't do them myself. And the folks in the back are having a ball. Their arms are in the air. They're waving them like they just don't care. The people in the middle are literally white-knuckled, biting their nails. And then my man in the front is calling ahead, probably ordering his pizza for when he gets off the ride. And this just illustrates, again, that stress is a response to a stressor. And everybody can interpret it differently. But then you have the concept of toxic stress. And I kind of like to think of it in this way. Stress actually can be a good thing. It was designed to be a good thing. It was designed really to save us. So when the lion is chasing us across the savannah, the lion is the stressor, and our body decides that in order to survive, we have to have the fight or flight response. Blood has to flow to our muscles, our eyes dilate so we could take in more light. We get fast, we run, we get out of there. It's a good thing. Eustress, it's called. Now, stress is tolerable when we have temporary stress responses. So there's some kind of ongoing stress, but we actually feel like we do have the resources or we do have the relationships in our life to be able to manage it. Toxic stress is prolonged activation of the stress response. So when we feel overwhelmed, when life is just too much for us, when things are happening to us like adverse childhood events in our childhood and we don't have the supportive relationships to be able to make sense of it or to be able to make it not have physical effects on our body. And this prolonged activation of the stress response in children can disrupt the development of the brain architecture and increase the risk for stress-related diseases, as well as cognitive impairment. And those diseases aren't just diseases of childhood, they put us at risk for later diseases down the line that start from the chronic stress in childhood and then become chronic stress as an adult and manifest as diabetes, ulcers, strokes, heart attacks, asthma, COPD. And this slide just kind of gives some ideas of the physical effects down the line that you can experience. As I mentioned, everything from acid reflux to weight gain, type 2 diabetes, aging, cancers, fibromyalgia, muddled thinking, insomnia, etc. So now, can the effects of toxic stress be passed on to the next generation? I see a lot of people nodding. Absolutely. And we're going to talk about how that happens. So epigenetics is the study of how the 3 billion base pairs, or 46 chromosomes, 23 from your mother, 23 from your father, how the sequence of those things doesn't change, but the DNA itself can get tagged with chemical markers. And those chemical markers happen on certain genes, or, they happen on certain genes. And then that tells the cell what genes to read and what genes to skip over, not to read. So that explains why in your body, you have these billions of cells, but and they all have the same DNA, but they all look and function differently. So your eye cell is different than your heart cell. Well, at least I hope it is. And your skin cells are different than your toenail cells, right? That's because even though they have the same DNA, the same blueprints, your eye cell is only reading those genes that say, I'm an eye cell, and I'm going to have brown pigment, and I'm going to be able to interpret light. Whereas your heart cell reads a set of genes that says, I'm a heart cell, and I'm going to beat, and I'm going to contract and make the whole heart beat together. So that's essentially epigenetics, the science of looking at how DNA gets activated, certain areas get activated and others don't. And that happens in very specific ways, which I won't necessarily go into, but there are certain chemicals that get added to the DNA. Like I said, it gets tagged in certain places. And the important thing is that environmental factors like food, toxins, medications, and stress can actually cause that tagging to happen differently. So these are 2 really key studies that really underscore the importance of epigenetics and the fact that epigenetics is the way that the effects of toxic stress get handed down from one generation to the next. So, in 1944, World War II, the Germans were occupying Holland and creating these food shortages. So all the women that were pregnant during that time were forced to be on a 1,000-calorie-day diet or less. And what they found is that those survivors, which were around the children who were born from those women, when they're probably around 60 or 70 now, when they studied those individuals, they found that they had alterations in a certain key gene that was important to insulin, how insulin works in the body, and how the body grows, the metabolism. And those children had higher rates of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. Then they also looked at, in a separate study, descendants of Holocaust survivors. So different from the first study where the women were actually pregnant when they were going through the stress of caloric restriction, in this study, the women became pregnant after they survived the stress of the Holocaust. And they still found alterations in certain key genes. This one, FKBP5, is related to the immune system and also to glucocorticoids, which are our stress hormones. So you've heard of adrenaline, you've heard of testosterone. All those are hormones that are related to your endocrine system and the way that you manage stress. So this gene manufactures those kinds of proteins and the things that interact with them. And they found that descendants of Holocaust survivors had higher rates of depression, PTSD, hypertension, and obesity. And I just want to say, what do those diseases kind of sound like? Health disparities that we experience. And this is a wordy slide, but basically the bottom line here is that there are also changes that are seen in these scenarios. Babies that have prenatal stressors, such as maternal depression and anxiety, or their mothers were exposed to stress. Adults with a history of childhood maltreatment, early parental death, and childhood trauma. Postmortem brains from adult suicide victims, and individuals who suffer from depression or bipolar disorder. All these individuals or types of scenarios, they all have alterations in the gene that codes for the receptor for glucocorticoids, those same chemicals that determine your stress response. And so, as I was saying before, those diseases sound like diseases that we as African Americans experience that are called or related to health disparities. And so the Holocaust was 12 years. The famine in Holland was 1 year. This is 400 years of repeated traumas from the moment of capture to today. And the cumulative effects of that toxic stress being passed on from generation to generation to generation, it is no wonder that there are health disparities in these very same diseases that we're seeing with just one generation of a trauma in Jewish Holocaust survivors and in the Dutch. So, can we understand resiliency through epigenetics? Thank you, yes, because you know I'm about to break that down. So, just a mention that most of the things that influence our health and well-being are not in the doctor's office. Only about 20% of things actually take place in a clinical setting that actually influence health outcomes. 10% is the environment, so clean air, clean water. 30% are health behaviors, for example, whether we exercise, whether we choose to smoke. And then 40% are social determinants of health. And social determinants of health are those social circumstances that influence our ability to be healthy. And they include everything from poverty and deprivation to unhealthy and unsafe physical environments, the ability to find work, the ability to get a good education, transportation, stigma, racism, and discrimination. And it's actually seen that these social determinants of health, as seen in individuals that live in urban areas below the poverty line, that these things actually are affecting people at a cellular level in their DNA. So they did this study, and they looked at signs of DNA damage, for DNA damage in individuals that lived in urban environments who were poor. And when your cell divides, your chromosomes divide also. And the end caps of the chromosomes are called telomeres. And so a sign of aging is every time your chromosomes divide and get back together, the telomeres get shorter. And eventually they get short enough so that that's a signal to the cell that you can't divide anymore, you're old, and you need to be retired. So that shows, by looking at the length of the telomeres in the cell, it talks about premature aging. So they found that individuals that lived in urban areas who were poor had signs of premature telomere damage or DNA damage. And then how many people have heard about this study with African American men and telomeres? It's a fascinating study. So they looked at 92 African American men who reported exposure to racism, interpersonal acts of racism. And then they asked them, and they did a survey, a validated survey, to understand, did this affect your self-image? Did you internalize this negativity that you were exposed to, and did it affect your self-image and how you think of yourself? For those individuals who said yes, that they found that it did, they showed signs of premature aging as judged by their telomere length and damage to their DNA. But the miraculous thing is those individuals who did not, who showed that they had a healthy self-image despite this exposure to interpersonal racism, had no signs of premature DNA damage. It was like hiding the drum under your skin and being able to laugh in the bowels of the ship in the face of adversity. And I think that that is extremely instructive to how resiliency, how we are able to be resilient, to be able to, in the face of adversity, still be able to retain our positive self-image. And that affects us at a cellular level. So how can we use genomics in clinical practice? I'm just going to give some examples, again, from the practice that I'm associated with in DC. We have 5 locations, 1 in each quadrant of the city and 2 in the northwestern section of the city. And we do adult primary as well as, adult primary and specialty care, pediatrics, specialty and primary care. And we also do office-based opioid treatment. We're actually the largest provider of buprenorphine in DC. Buprenorphine is the drug that's used to counteract opioid cravings. And for those of you who don't know, DC is actually number 2 in the state rankings of deaths from opioid use disorder. Who knew that already? Nobody? Number 2, just behind West Virginia. So even though the opioid epidemic is painted as a suburban and rural problem, primarily among young Caucasians, that's not true. It's actually, as you know from here in Baltimore, it's been happening in the inner cities since post-Vietnam War. And in DC, we're no exception there. We're unfortunately have the distinction of being number 2 in the country in opioid deaths. I think the state of Maryland is number 6. And so we have a couple of paradigms that we use to decide the way that we approach patients in our practice. One is the concept of the pair of ACEs. So I talked about adverse childhood events before. Things like divorce, mental illness, incarceration, substance abuse in the family, domestic violence in the family. These can happen regardless of what color you are, where you live, your socioeconomic status. But what makes it particularly toxic is when it takes place in an environment of an adverse community. So where there's poverty, excess violence, discrimination, poor housing quality, etc. And this model is called the pair of ACEs. It was developed by a researcher named Wendy Ellis. The other paradigm that we use in our practice is that opioid use disorder is not a moral failing. It is a disease. It is trying to rectify the levels of dopamine in your brain. So think of dopamine as the pleasure chemical. It's the happy chemical in your brain that when it's in balance, you feel good. And the things that you normally would feel satisfaction from, when it's in balance, you do. But when it's out of balance and it's low in your brain, those things that you normally would get pleasure from, you don't. And so you start to go on an escalating episodes of trying to get that chemical back in balance. You start to do things repetitively and over, taking more risks to try to get that sense of pleasure in your brain. And that's what leads to addiction. And there are genetic causes of low dopamine and there are environmental causes. The genetic causes have been boiled down to about 10 genes that code for things related to the levels of dopamine in your brain. whether it be the dopamine receptor, and there's a specific variant where you are born with fewer dopamine receptors, or it could be the level of the other chemicals that help keep dopamine in balance, like the endocannabinoids. So those are the chemicals in your brain that are similar to cannabis. That's why they're called endocannabinoids. And that's why it's thought that opioid use disorder can be treated with marijuana or THC. And then on the environmental side, toxic stress, the pair of ACEs, have been shown to cause epigenetic downregulation. So the DNA gets tagged because you're going through these experiences, and it causes the body to produce less dopamine and produce less dopamine receptors. So it's a setup for potentially becoming addicted. You have a much lower threshold for addiction when you have survived toxic stress in the pair of ACEs. One of the things that we're doing in our practice is we have a grant with Howard University and NIMHD, National Institutes of Mental, Minority Health and Health Disparities, thank you, to look at the genetic test panel in individuals with opioid use disorder to see if it does indeed show that there's low dopamine, identify those individuals at highest risk for relapse in that way, and then work with a nutraceutical product. It's basically the precursors of dopamine to try to see if that can help treat the low dopamine and give people a better sense of being able to manage their addiction. The other thing that we're doing is looking at certain gene tests that help to figure out how your body processes medications. So there are roughly 4 speeds at which your body can process medications. You could be a poor metabolizer, meaning you process medicine slowly, intermediate, extensive, or ultra rapid. And we're specifically interested in the genes that help to process or that create the enzymes that process buprenorphine, the drug that we use to treat opioid use disorder. And it's called CYP3A4, I'll just call it 3A4 and 3A5. Those are specific genes. And there's a variant of that gene that causes you to burn through buprenorphine quickly. You process it really quickly. Well, it turns out that in people of African descent, 82% in one study of people of African descent had that gene that caused them to burn through buprenorphine quickly. So, what just happened? Okay. So we decided to look for that in our practice. So we looked at 170 patients, African Americans, and lo and behold, 85% had that kind of gene that made you burn through buprenorphine very quickly. Well, why is that important? Well, there's a certain dosing limit. You can only prescribe 24 milligrams of buprenorphine. So if somebody comes to you and says, wow, I still feel like I have cravings, this isn't holding me, a lot of providers will think that that person is drug seeking or malingering, or they're trying to get more so they can sell it on the street. And so they get stigmatized and they don't get treated. Well, by looking at this study, we're showing that a large portion of people who are African American or of African descent are going to process buprenorphine more rapidly. And the dosing studies, of course, were done in Caucasians who only have a 9% rate of having that drug. And insurance companies won't pay for the higher rate. So we've had to do a lot of lobbying of insurance companies to make sure that they'll pay for that higher dose. But I think as it pertains to resiliency, most of the individuals in our practice are over 40. As I said, in inner cities, the heroin epidemic looks very different. It's older, black man or woman, because 40% of the people in our practice are women, 40, 50, 60, or 70. And we think that one of the reasons that they have such a high rate of having this variant is it's conferred a survival advantage. Many of these people have been doing heroin since the 70s, and they've never overdosed successfully. They've never killed themselves. Why is that? Well, they have a gene that causes them to burn through heroin quickly, because it's the same gene that metabolizes buprenorphine, and allows them to survive and not overdose. Unfortunately, stronger drugs are now on the market, which is why people are now dying. And then finally, because I see you, one of the things that we're doing is we have to diagnose the undiagnosed. So we have put together an integrated model of care to be able to identify mental health issues, social determinants of health issues, and put together the resources in the practice, psychologists and social workers, along with primary care doctors, along with addiction specialists, to be able to provide integrated care. We also have peer navigators that help us build on the resiliency that people have, those support structures, as well as give them additional skills to be able to, or help them develop additional skills to be able to improve their health outcomes. And then we help to take down barriers between different referral agencies in the city so that people can navigate that situation and get effective health care seamlessly. And just a quick commercial, we recently got a grant to do telehealth and specifically telepsychiatry, and we're looking for psychiatrists who want to participate in that with us. So if you're interested, please see me afterwards. And then finally, I wanted to talk a little bit just about living beyond stress. In a clinical environment, how can we promote those practices for our patients that help them develop the emotional and spiritual resiliency to live beyond stress? Because really, ultimately, that's really what the protective factor is in making sure that we don't have those epigenetic tags placed on our DNA that we can then transmit to other generations. Meditation, for example, helps to establish a state of relaxation, and it decreases stress hormones. So does exercise. So do certain foods that we eat. It helps to restore balance, eliminate inflammation, and decrease stress hormones in the blood. And by practicing those things on a daily, consistent basis, those are the things that really help us live beyond the level of stress. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Clarke. That was enlightening, thank you. In the interest of time, we can take maybe 1 or 2 questions. If you would like to ask a question, please. Yes, ma'am.
Have you applied that study to methadone? So for methadone, a different gene governs methadone. It's 2D6. Yes. And that actually, conversely, African American patients metabolize methadone a lot slower. They're slow metabolizers of methadone. And so I'll never forget, we actually are co-located with a methadone clinic. We provide primary care to methadone patients. And I went and sat in on a couple of group sessions. And I was struck by the fact, now this just might be anecdotal, but there were 6 women. One was Caucasian, one was young African-American woman, and then the other 4 were sort of middle-aged African-American women. The 4 middle-aged African-American women, they get their dose and then they come to the session. They were nodding off. The Caucasian woman was wide awake, and the young African-American woman was kind of in between nodding off and in between awake to be able to actually participate in the group session. And I remember thinking, wow, maybe the African-American women are slow metabolizers, and hence it's making them more sleepy than the Caucasian woman.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well, is it possible that we can get the a copy of the PowerPoint presentations, both you and Dr.
Sure.
Washington's?
Well, I can't speak for Dr. Washington, but I think we could probably work with Jan Desper-Peters to see how that could happen.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I see you've done a study on the effects on the Holocaust survivors, but have you thought about doing a study on the effects of those that survived slavery and what happened to them after the slaves were freed?
Right. So I can't see where you, oh, you're right there, I'm sorry. I don't want to imply that I did that study. That was another group, that study came out in 2008. And the other one with the Holocaust survivors, the one with the famine came out in 2008, the other one came out in 2014. So there's no way really to go back in history to do that epigenetic work. I do know that there is a repository at Howard University from the African burial ground, the individuals that were found in the grave site when they were trying to construct a skyscraper in New York, and they dug them up out of the ground, and they now are at Howard. Their remains are at Howard. And there is actually work going on to sequence the DNA of those individuals and compare them to modern day descendants, people of African descent. So I do know that that work is going on. I don't know specifically if they're looking at epigenetic markers of stress and how far they've gotten with it, but that work is going on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clarke. We appreciate you. So hopefully we're all able to take this back and we're able to share and disseminate this information as it impacts our practices and the people that we work with.